All right, everybody, welcome to another live cast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. We keep on going, and for this one, we're going to be talking about the Shrouded Isle. This is the latest game from Kitfox Games, which is a very interesting take on almost like a choose-your-own narrative kind of design. And joining me from Kitfox is designer and programmer Jongwoo.
Hi,
Hey Jongwoo, it's great to have you on.
it's a pleasure to be here.
All right, we are recording this in right now. It's in mid-August, so the Shrouded has been out for a few weeks now, and definitely congratulations on getting the game out. I know it's gotten a lot of interesting buzz regarding the design of it.
Yeah, we were pleasantly surprised by the coverage of it. I mean, it's a very niche game, and to be completely honest with you, we were just flabbergasted by the various reactions people have to the game. So it's been a great launch for sure.
hmm And for today's live cast, we're going to be talking about the design of the game and some of the decisions that came up with building it. But before we get to that, since this is your first time on the cast, could you, for people listening or watching, could you talk a little bit about your background when it comes to working at Kickbox Games?
Sure. As we mentioned at the beginning, my first name is Jongwoo, and I'm a co-founder and programmer at Kickbox Games. And as far as my background, so I began as a Soviet history major, but then I really wanted to go into game development, and so I decided to just give it a shot. Attended a year-long intensive game development course, and since then, afterwards, I worked in mobile dev for a few years, and then I moved to Montreal, which is where I live and work now, and met various team members of Kickbox, and then we decided to form a team, and now it's been like 4 years since we founded the company. Yeah, it's been interesting for sure.
hmm I think the last time I spoke to Kid Fox, I think I was talking to Tanya, and
Right,
that was regarding Moon Hunters.
right,
Were you a part of the Moon Hunters team?
right. So I was doing gameplay programming for Moon Hunters. So a lot of the initial combat programming was my work.
Cool. So, with that, we'll talk a little bit more about the Shrouded Isle. What was your role on that game?
For the Shrouded Isle, it's an interesting case because this might not be as widely known, but so it was never meant as a primary daytime project for Kitbox. So it's almost more of a personal project that involves myself and a few other collaborators, which happens to include Tanya as well. And so the vast majority of the design work in that game is my work. The entirety of the programming in that game is my work.
hmm Interesting. So, it originally didn't start out as being a full commercial product?
Right. So it began as a part of our entry for Ludum Dare 33, and the theme at the time was "You are the monster." And the way we interpreted the theme was not as a physical monstrosity, but as like someone who makes monstrous choices, like someone who is a bit of an administrative monster. And that's how the idea of being a cult leader of a small secluded community that sacrifices a member of the village every season. That's how the concept began. Um, so when we finished the jam, we got some amount of attention for it because, as you can see in the final product, it had a very striking art style. The yellow-blue contrast, which is it's very striking, and in some cases, it's a bit intense for certain people. But because it stood out so much, it made sense to further develop that project. And so, on a part-time basis, we've been working on it for about a year, um, and and I came out just early, like I guess it's been a week or 2 weeks now since launch.
hmm Yeah. So I'm sorry. What game jam did you say the original idea was from?
Ludum Dare.
Oh, God. Very interesting. And it's kind of interesting how you interpreted the theme was you are the monster, and kind of took that with the Shrouded Isle. What I guess one thing that I found very interesting about the design or that general motif of the game, I know I've talked to a few people about, was like again like the kind of lore of this game is very fascinating by the fact that you're I mean we call it sort of like a cultist simulator in a matter of speaking.
Yeah, very much in a matter of speaking. So we were definitely influenced by Lovecraft. Um, but broadly, it just came together very quickly. We knew we wanted like a kind of a dark, like a horror oriented theme, and so our artist Erica, she was a big fan of Bloodborne at the time. So she incorporated a lot of Victorian designs and flares into the look, and then since then, another aspect of the motif, as far as the writing's concerned, anyway. Tanya is very much into Slavic mythology, and so a lot of the character names are borrowed from Slavic name origins.
And of course, the god that you're sacrificing to, Chernobyl, right?
Right. Like literal dark god of Slavic myths, yeah, for sure.
Now, I guess with the Shroud Isle from the game jam to where it is, or where it was for the retail version, was there like did the design like change dramatically from the game jam concept to full release, or did it keep relatively like stable from beginning to end?
I would argue it changed pretty dramatically, and there was so there were multiple changes, of course, and if you actually, compare them side by side, like, there are numerous. But the biggest change I'd say is in the resources. So in the original Game Jam version, it was relatively straightforward resource management in the sense that it is an island village, so they raise food, they grow food, they need shelter. We had a value for faith, whatever. So initially, I tried to further expand the core game that way. And I ran into a couple troubles. One is that because we wanted the political conflict between the different families to be a central aspect of the game. It was important that each family had a particular niche that they fulfill, and but the problem being that just in terms of how players would intuitively understand the value of food versus the value of gold or what have you. Like, there's some things that seem absolutely necessary for survival on a remote island versus things that seem luxurious. So as a result of that, I made the decision to move towards far more like psychological, religious resource management. And so in the current version of the game, you'll notice that the 5 resources that you manage are, the values of ignorance, fervor, and so forth. And it also had another aspect where the trait system from the original Game Jam release that we had, it was difficult to justify, hey, this person is strong, therefore he's better at farming, he's better at building, whereas with the new religious resources, it was easier to find interesting traits that would raise something or lower something. As you can see with sadist being very, very passionate and so forth.
Okay. Now, I guess keeping with the design, when I was looking at the game, I think I mentioned this in my review, or at least to friends, it really draws to me some comparisons with the classic strategy game King of Dragon Pass, in the sense that you're not really given 100% accurate information. You're it's getting fed through your 5 houses, or in King of Dragon Pass, through your advisors.
Right.
Did that game have any inspiration for you when you were coming up with the Shrouded Isle, or is this just like a lucky coincidence?
Like I wouldn't be surprised if there was like some level of subconscious influence. I mean, I did play King of Dragon Pass
Yeah.
before, and also I did extensive research to like other games that had like for whatever like I could be inspired by. That being said, though, I wasn't explicitly trying to be inspired by that subjectivist aspect of King of Dragon Pass. If anything, like I really appreciated the advisor systems that they had in that game. Like the advisors will just comment on like anything you do in that game, which is fascinating. I'm actually curious about like just like the raw amount of content that they needed to have in order to support a system like that.
Yeah.
I think though, sorry, it was about like filtering through the families. Like, was that the core of the question?
Yeah, like kind of filtering information through the lore of the families as opposed to just like straightforward numbers. Like this will give you 10 fervor, or this will give you 5 ignorance, or stuff along those lines, and how kind of like the lore and the gameplay became intersected.
Right. I think in this case, we really like the core idea of these five families that that rule the town, or that are like the essence of the town, and the five families all being like performing a crucial aspect of the cult's management of the town. And in some ways, I guess like it's like that had a motivational priority. Like and like we found ways to incorporate that together with the resource management system that made sense for the project. I mean, it's interesting how things intersect now, but like just looking back at like the various iterations I went through to get to this point, I just like reflecting on it. It's interesting for me.
Now, going back to what you're saying in terms of the resources or what the player is supposed to be managing, you
Yep.
talked about how things kind of changed. Like the original form was going to be like more generic survival, like food, gold, or stuff along those lines.
Right.
Was there any, like, as things change, did you have any more in terms of managing the settlement in the game? Like, for those of you watching this right now, in the Shroud Isle, in this version of it, your major choices, of course, are who's going to be your advisor from each house, and then what you're going to do during the 3 months of each season, which in turn affects your resources. But was there any more in terms of, I guess, player input or player decision making earlier in the design process?
Earlier on, there was a phase where, so when it was like very much the physical resources, there was a phase where you were redistributing the resources among the families. Like with physical goods, that makes more sense. Um, I think the way the monthly actions work right now, the core of it hasn't changed that much through development. But I mean, one thing I've always wanted to do is like make the actual process. Like you'll if you play the game, you'll see that so and so tried to flagellate the sinners, but like this outcome happens. And I really want there to be more about that. Like, how do you react to that? Like, when you discover that, so and so's vice is that they're gluttonous, what do you do about that? It's something that just has been on a priority list of things to do that I'd love to extend in the game that yeah, couldn't get around to yet.
Yeah. And talking about extending the Shroud Isle, I definitely want to touch on that later on this cast because I really want to, because that's a very interesting topic for a game like this. Because
Right.
it is such a, I'm not sure, would you consider this like a narrative driven game or more of like could be like sort of like a narrative or like an action driven game?
It- it's an interesting question because I've shown this at various conventions, and of course, like there's like public feedback now that the game's out. And some people look at the bars and think, "Wow, this is very much numbers-driven management game, and you could certainly play it that way." But other people look at the aesthetics of the game and the various story events, the fact that it's so character-focused, and they want to believe it's a narrative-focused game. My goal with the project was, so very early on there was like an opportunity to make it much more linear, I guess, or rather like much less systemic than it is. And I wanted to try as much as possible to make it a systemic game, but at the same time still keep the essence, like keep the aesthetics that made it interesting in the first place. And so the way I approached it was the sacrifice, the dark ritual was the anchor around which everything else was built. Everything needed to connect back to that somehow. And so that's why the advisors, on one hand, sure, like they are raising the various virtues in your town, but on the other hand, by making them take actions, you reveal things about them, and then you have a better reason to, sacrifice one person or the other, or like when you gain increase, like when you raise approvals with a certain house in the village. Now you have more opportunities to find out about people, so that you can find the major sinners in the village to kill them. And I think that the moment when that moment of discovery, like when you realize, oh, this is the person I've been looking for, or when you realize, the aesthetic advisor that you were employing turned out also to be a liar or something like that. Like that sense of betrayal that happens. I'm not sure if we could have captured that by having a purely narrative-driven experience. I feel that like with the cohesion of the systems and the narrative in the game, it creates a much more interesting whole.
Yeah. And it sounds very similar to what we see in like tactical strategy games such as like XCOM, or any games where you can like name a character or you get to know the in-game characters, and it becomes a lot more interesting when you start putting in these game elements that affect these characters. Like in something like Battle Brothers, for instance, like you can name all your heroes, you can send them out, and then what happens when, let's say, someone gets wounded in the eye, or they lose an eye, and now your favorite archer is nearsighted, or or like something in XCOM where you name all your squads have your friends and family, and then you get wiped on a terror mission.
Right. Or you have to leave someone behind because you were too aggressive, or like stuff happens, and you're invested into these characters, and even though like you could treat them as just pure statues, like people generally won't. People are emotionally invested, and I think it's a cool outcome of the project.
Now, here's one question that I know that if I don't ask, my fans are going to let me have it after this cast. But we have to talk a little bit about the art style. I know you brought it up a few minutes ago in terms of that very, very distinctive and very polarizing look to the game. And I know at this point, I'm sure no one has mentioned about how the art style looks. I'm sure there's been no comments on Steam, but it's definitely very striking. I know, like, for myself and for a few other people, it can be a little bit hard on the eyes, especially when you're staring at it for like 30 minutes plus. Absolutely. So I guess the first question is, what was the decision behind having such an evocative art style for the game?
So as I mentioned earlier, the artist for the project, or the lead artist for the project, Erica, she, like during the game jam, chose the particular aesthetic very quickly. But the rationale was something like this. We were doing game jams, like it was like must have been like a 5th or 6th game jam just that year, and we were kind of on a roll. But at the same time, I think there was a sense in which we wanted to make something very different. We wanted to make something that's also efficient as well. And for Erica personally, she also wanted to challenge herself by putting restrictions. And so the two-tone aesthetic comes from that. As far as why yellow and blue in particular were chosen, I'm like less able to speak on that. I think it was just an intuitive decision on her part. Um, Beyond that, though, we do have other color schemes available in the game through the settings menu. We did get various feedback that hey, it is hard on the eyes, or even we get feedback from streamers saying that it's hard to read and so forth. And so there are like some accessibility options that way. We recently added the black and white color scheme as well. All that being said, though, it's become such an iconic part of the project that I don't know. Like I wonder if any of this would have happened if we had the blue and red color scheme that we have as an option, for instance, as the default look, and would people have cared? Maybe not. Maybe they would. But
Yeah, it's always tricky about that, especially when you have very specific options in your game menus. Like for a lot of people, they will look at like your default screen or wherever your default settings as kind of the law of the land kind of thing. Like they won't try and change things, and it's of course very tricky, especially when you're doing such a very interesting art style. And I do have to say, I really love that kind of like hand drawn, very gothic look to the game that it's set up.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. The intricate details in the various elements of the game, like visual elements of the game, they really add to the feel of the project for sure.
Now, I don't know if you know the answer to this, Jongwoo, but did the artist, did you say her name was Erica?
That's correct, yeah.
Was she particularly inspired by any movies or anything else that kind of led to that hand-drawn aesthetic for the Shrouded Isle?
I believe the overall aesthetic that she chose is something that she's been working on for a while. She's very diligent. She's the kind of person that doesn't, will make a painting in 30 minutes every day kind of thing. And so you might notice that some of the portraits have somewhat of an anime-esque feel to them, and that's kind of the style that she likes to pursue. Sketchy, anime-esque, horror inspired. Beyond that, I'm not sure if there were any particular IPs that she was inspired by besides of Bloodborne, for instance, and Victorian architecture.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting back to the design of the Shrouded Isle, I want to talk a little bit more about the houses themselves and your interaction with them. So, for those of you watching this right now, the general gameplay of your interaction with the 5 houses is that depending upon your favor or your, I guess what's the actual term? My mind's blinking.
The term is approval.
Approval, thank you. Yeah. Sorry about that. In terms of your approval with each house will determine the number of basically leads or secrets that you can get from them for each season. And then in turn, this is how you decide or you learn about their various traits. And each member of the house will have one positive trait or a virtue and one negative trait or a vice. And we'll talk more about the seasons or what you do in a few minutes. But with the houses themselves, did this kind of interaction go through any major iterations during development?
They absolutely did. So at an earlier point in development, there were options to actually talk to the members of the house, and that was originally how I wanted the inquiries to work. In fact, it was less get information ticket the way it works right now, and more so about so and so said this about this other person. And when I initially implemented that, it was interesting because once people realized that they could get rumors, people were spending their entire time just clicking on everybody and trying to get them to get say rumors about other people. And it wasn't clear what was useful information versus what's not useful information. And also, because there's a sheer number of characters in a given playthrough, it was difficult for players to keep track uh, um, uh, of who's what, or like what is known about whom. And so like it became streamlined over time. In fact, like I think initially you were even able to find out rumors about the house leaders themselves. They were effectively just treated like any other character. And I think if I were to expand the project, like I would like to bring some element of that back, because the idea of just you're an actual person like engaging with the townspeople, and you're able to get a glimpse into their day-to-day affairs was something that was creatively important to me in this project, and I wish I could flesh that out somewhere.
Yeah. And again, like, it's very interesting regarding the abstraction of each one of these houses. Like, one house just handles security for the island, another one handles like food distribution, and like that kind of stuff isn't really, at least for the section that we're talking about right now, isn't really all that brought into the conversation. It's more along the lines of, okay, what does so and so do, or what do you think about so and so? And then trying to figure out who's, the big targets, I guess.
Right. I mean, that's, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, the streamlining very much about who has the major vices is what it came down to. And so, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just about to ask, one thing that I'm curious about, the idea that every person or every house member having one vice and one virtue, was that always there? Like, was there ever a time when you could have someone with maybe two vices or two virtues, or did you always want to have like everyone having something good and something bad to them?
That was always there, and the idea of having someone who is fully virtuous or fully having two vices did come up during development. And so partly for just like technical reasons, it was more work to do it that way. But the other side of it is that, especially in the case of someone who has two virtues, there's no reason not to use that person. Like, there's no risk in using that person. So just and as far as like representing characters and like representing like believable people in games, I think the fact that everyone has a strength and a weakness, so to speak, works in the setting.
Mm-hmm. Now, with the decisions, or with like trying to figure out like who's who and stuff like that, as you said, as you streamline the interactions between yourself and the various houses, was there a point when the player could choose between more interactions between the houses than what it is right now?
That was an option that we explored briefly, but because of what was going on for the development of the way the work phase functions right now, it was important that each house was valuable in some way. Mm-hmm. And it was important that the player isn't motivated to just extinguish any given house just for this. That should not be a dominant strategy for the game. So I guess it was just pushed to the back burner. There were ideas about having a favor system, or like a house that refuses to cooperate with you because your approval with them is so low, or due to repeated sacrifices, or maybe it's an event, whatever. Those are definitely things we'd love to look at further in the future.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think with that said, let's talk about the actual what's going on during the seasons themselves, or your 3 months. Okay. So, for people watching, this is pretty much like the main game player. Your major decisions are going to be coming from the various 3 months, because this will determine essentially whether you're going to have a chance at winning or losing. So, for this part of the Shrouded Isle, did it go through any major iterations from jam to iteration to release?
Absolutely. If you look at the jam version, So first of all, you don't even select advisors. For those of you who haven't looked at the game yet, at the start of each season, you have to select one advisor from each of the 5 families, and you can kind of see it as like being a tribute in the Hunger Games, for instance. Like, it is an honor. It is an actual role that like a powerful role for an individual to play in this society. But at the same time, there's a risk that you will die because one of those 5 advisors will be the seasonal sacrifice. And so the difference between the Jam version and the final release is in that originally the houses just simply raised a stat. So I believe the Kegni were specialists at food production. So you could order them to produce food or build shelter or evangelize. And so like each family either was a generalist or was a specialist at one of those 3 stats. And the problem with that approach, of course, was that players would just stack whatever was the most useful at the time. And so like the main economic sink in the Game Jam version is random events that happen. So, a storm destroys your shelters or whatever. And so the next turn, obviously, the players would just build shelters. And so it was very simplistic. But at the same time, that essence of getting each of the 5 families to contribute, getting them to work together for the season for a common goal. I wanted to represent that even in the final project. And as far as the iterations that happened on it, there were multiple. Early on, we considered maybe someone just gets randomly picked, but then it felt unfair, or it felt like you just had no control over the situation. Like, what is the point of discovering traits if you can't really pick the people, And so it just made sense for the player to be the one that appoints characters, and I think it had this a sense of causality, or rather like. The player felt, even though you could effectively represent the similar assignment mechanics in other ways, by the fact that the player is the one that's actually going and visiting and saying this particular person, even if they don't have enough information to make a meaningful decision at the start of the game, that agency helped create the sense of causality between, I selected this person there and I made them be the prominent advisor this season, and therefore this outcome happened. Whereas in earlier iterations, it felt like stats were just going up and down for completely random reasons.
And that is very tricky, not just in a game like this, but in any game that asks the player to make choices or do any kind of commanding. If the player, if you can't see that relationship between action and response, or action and impact, it becomes, as you just said, the player's just pushing buttons and things are happening. Right, and it becomes very hard to then process, I just won, but why? That kind of thing.
Exactly.
Now, one thing that I found very interesting about this part of the game that I want to get your thoughts on, Jongwoo, is the fact that when you pick the advisors, the number of advisors, for those of you who don't play, you can choose between 1 and 3. Right. And the more advisors you pick, the more their impact is diluted. In the sense that if I just pick one advisor, we're going to see a massive boost in whatever they're doing. But then also, if it's something bad, they have a major vice, we're going to see a massive decline somewhere else. Right. But if I pick 3, we're going to see more of a generalized, but it's not going to hit as hard on either front. So I was just wondering, what was the rationale or the decision-making behind this kind of either all-in or delusion, or diluting, I should say?
Right. So as I mentioned when I was discussing the differences between the Game Jam versus the final release, creating that sense of risk in the work phase was important, or at least creating the sense of a player agency was important. And what I found with so when we initially did it and had just like, hey, select the one advisor, it was still very obvious that, okay, so this thing is low, so I will pick the advisor that raises that stat the most. And it gets a bit more complicated once you become more aware of the traits. And since like everyone's like more often than not, like a given advisor will affect essentially three values at the same time, right? Because of whatever their family specialty is, plus whatever their virtue is, and what their vice is. But even then, this choice felt very simplistic. And the other aspect that concerned me was that I really wanted the politics of the families to be represented in the work phase. And, favoritism should be a thing. But at first I couldn't figure out a way to like not like make the player just choose like whatever's the most advantageous at that moment. And so then I experimented with the system that we have right now with the multi-select. So the more people you choose, the more distributed the effect, diluted the effect becomes. But even in that case, a lot of players will just do it like three must be better than one sort of thing, and intuitively a lot of players I find will just select three and be disappointed that not that much changes. And of course after the first season players catch on to the fact that hey, fewer advisors selected, the more of an impact, but I don't know. There's multiple layers to this particular segment of the game. It intersects with so first of all, obviously it affects the five values of the cult, but it intersects very closely with how the approval systems work, and as a result of that, it sets up the context for why you make the choice in the sacrifice phase. Because maybe things went well or things didn't go well during the work phase, or maybe because you had to raise a certain thing and you depended on this particular character from this particular family to raise that thing, now everyone's slightly less happy, and maybe a family went down to a rebellious state. And sorry, I guess I'm rambling a bit now, but it's like it is the part that is it's at the crux of it in a lot of ways, right? Like so many things get like subtly affected or very, very strongly affected. And I wanted the player to, again, like feel like they have agency over that, even if there's maybe like a rational choice or two or three rational choices in any given moment. But you can trace it back to the start of this. I did this. I chose these two advisors, and I discovered that this advisor is a liar, and therefore I'm not selecting that person again. But now these other families are less happy with me, and so forth. Like this chain of reactions. Yeah.
And that's one of the very fascinating parts about the Shrouded Isle is so far our little chat. I mean, we are about looks like just over like 40 minutes in. Each like section that we've talked about is like in of itself its own like little mini game or its own little design system, and it's very similar to like what we talk about with like King of Dragon Pass. That it really becomes like greater than the sum of its parts in terms of how all these interactions will lead in or feed into another system, which then affects things as a whole. And I guess one other question that I wanted to ask regarding I just lost it. Damn. Let me see if I can remember very quickly. With the here, now I remember. As you said earlier, when you choose the advisors, they will have three impacts. Whatever their house's role is, whatever their virtue, and whatever their vice. Right. Now, I've noticed while I'm playing that there are cases where you can get either a extra good outcome or an extra bad outcome. Like, let's say someone who's trying to do ignorance, they find a very old book, you get plus ignorance. Or let's say they find nothing. Yep. Do the vices and virtues affect those events, or is that just random?
They are random.
Okay.
But there is something else that does affect the the actual work, whether it's flagellating things, and that is the omens, the dreams that you have.
Okay.
And but yeah, like I wanted some variance with the actual ritual itself, because otherwise it felt like during multiple playtests, like there wasn't enough risk in choosing someone to, like, I know it'll go up, X amount. But at the same time, I didn't want it to feel too random either. It was difficult balancing that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. Whenever we could certainly take like an hour right now to just like randomization and probability in game design, because
absolutely.
that is a trick in just about in any game. Because as we all know, when gamers perceive these kinds of choices, it's basically black or white. Either it happens 100% of the time, or it happens none of the time. And it's very hard to convey that sense of probability. I mean, hell, I've played Darkest Dungeon and XCOM this past year, and there are cases where I will hit, 40% chance, and then there are times I will miss at 90 or 95% chance.
Right.
And
I mean, sorry, yeah.
Oh no, go ahead.
I mean, intellectually, it was the 5% that of failure, but just intuitively, it's like 95. That's practically guaranteed. I think though, in this particular case, there's something about incompetence. There's this sense of you assign agency to these characters because you told them to do something and they didn't do it exactly the way you wanted it to. So when it has a poor outcome, there's a sense of blame on that particular character. Why didn't you? It was such a simple job. It was the least you could do. And having that element of surprise and having the player react to that it was important to me, because I mean, at some point the trait all the traits are discovered, or the player might be motivated to only employ advisors that they know the traits of. And just having that a bit of randomness, because very much other aspects of the game, once it's generated at the start of the game, once the characters have been generated, other aspects are not random, and so having that bit of randomness, I felt added a bit more unpredictability that adds to sense of despair or just oppressiveness that I wanted to convey in the project.
Yeah. And as you said, it's very tricky in terms of conveying that information to the player, especially when we talk about in the next few minutes about the fail or win state of the Shrouded Isle, which in of itself is also another major decision.
Yep.
So I think before we move on to talk about the actual ritual, with the actual decision making during the seasons, again, with the change of the game in terms of interacting and again the player's options, in terms of playtesting, was there any arguments over, again, going back to your choices in terms of what can I actually influence? Again, for those of you watching this right now, when we talk about this part of the game, your choices are basically, again, 1 to 3 advisors for each month. 1, 2, 3, we go to the ritual. Was there any point when you could decide even more, saying, I want you to do your job, let's say, extra, or I'm going to choose you, but I don't want you to do too much? How did you guys, dial in just how much decision making the player should have at this particular point in the game?
I don't think there ever was. We ever had a effort level in the actions. So the trick thing here actually is that from a macro scale, the Shrouded Isle is a closed ecosystem. Right?
Yes.
And so what I discovered very quickly as a result of playtesting is that stats tend to spiral up very quickly, or they they crash very quickly as well. Even if the numbers are slightly additive on average. And so in that regard, it wasn't what can I say adding more interactions as far as gaining more resources, that wasn't quite the priority in this section. What was a priority, I would say, is finding a way to make sure that the overall balance of the game remains relatively consistent through multiple years of a playthrough, while still making the sacrifice phase a meaningful choice.
Yeah. And speaking about the sacrifice, I think we can talk a little bit more about that point. Now, for those of you again watching, the sacrifice, of course, happens at the end of each season. This is when it's time to choose someone to die. And of course, you can't avoid this. You can't say, I really like everyone, so no one gets sacrificed. It doesn't happen. Someone has to bite the bullet here. So, for this part, was this another element that was kind of added in after the game jam, or was this something that you had in mind during that point of development?
What are you referring to?
The actual ritual part when you had to decide who to kill, and then the repercussions from that.
Okay, so this was always at the core of the game experience. So even the game jam version has the sacrifice phase at the end of each season. I don't think we really fleshed out the consequences of the sacrifice as well in the game jam version. And so to get back to what we're talking about with the change from material resources to religious resources, it was difficult to justify why food would go up or down as a result of someone getting killed. Whereas it was much easier to justify that this person's death sets an example to the town, whether it's a good example or a bad example, and therefore it affects the stats. And we've always, even in the game jam, we intended for the family opinions to be greatly affected by the sacrifice, but we never got around to it. So that was one of the things we greatly fleshed out for the final release.
All right. Now,
so can I make one comment about because you were talking about being forced to kill someone. That's an interesting part of the design that's come back a couple times.
Yeah.
Because if people ask, well, what if I don't want to kill anybody? And for a short time, I actually had an option for not killing. And during playtest, what I've found is that generally players were underwhelmed by the choice because nothing happens, or rather nothing dramatic happens, right? I could have mechanical consequences to it, but still not engaging with the sacrifice was other than the just doing it for the lark of it the first time. It seemed like opt out that was not interesting, and also it made the balancing more difficult. And so subsequently I took it out. I do wonder about it because I would much rather have the player choose to kill someone because they thought it was the best thing to do for whatever reason. I'm reminded of games like Spec Ops: The Line, where the only way to progress in the game is to do terrible things or do slightly less terrible but still pretty terrible things. And so in this case, I wonder if if in the final release, if we had don't sacrifice anyone and had appropriate consequences for that, if it would have been a more engaging experience for the player. Something that I might look at for expansions.
Yeah, and it's always tricky whenever you have these decisions that you basically force the player to do. As you said, Spec Ops: The Line is a really good example of that. If the player had the choice, they probably would have just walked the other way and not do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But there are those points where the game just says, "No, you're going to have to be a rotten person right now. You got to do this."
Absolutely.
like wisdom like the Shrouded Isle, as you said, like up until this point, the player is given like full agency. They decide what advisors to choose. They decide what to run the seasons, and then at this point, basically control, at least in some extent, is taken away. Like you still decide who gets to die, but that is your choice.
Right.
And there's definitely like a very, I think there's definitely a morality discussion here, or a philosophy discussion regarding, again, like putting the player or making them forced to do something bad in terms of like how they perceive that.
Right.
Now, with this part, now one thing I want to ask you about, Jongwoo, that I was a little bit confused about myself was regarding the various impacts in terms of the resources when it comes to sacrificing. Because depending upon what house you sacrifice, it will either raise or lower specific resource or one of the 5 specific traits.
Right.
And I was just a little bit confused about the, like, why doing this house affected these resources versus this house affecting these resources.
So for clarity, it is not based on the house, but it's based on the individual's traits.
Okay.
And it inverts it, which is an interesting twist.
Mm.
So, like, I mean, you are making an example of this person. So, in fact, the worse their vice, the better example they make. But the greater their virtue, the more confusing message you're sending to the populace. And as far as the effect on the house, it's more direct. Their opinion, however much it gets affected, is based on how much you've investigated that person and whether that person in fact was a major sinner or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I think talking about the sacrifice and moving on, I think we can really talk about one of the more interesting aspects, I think one of the more polarizing parts of the Shrouded Isle, and that is the win state and the lose state for the game.
Right.
Now, for those of you who haven't played the Shrouded Isle, the challenge of the game, as we've said, is about managing these 5 core resources of your cult. And basically what happens is there's 2, or I should actually say there may be 3 ways that you can actually lose. One is you don't, actually, Jongwoo, I guess I'm curious, at the end of each season, I know Schernbog, you get your vision saying, find so-and-so, find the artist, find the embezzler, or whatever. Right. If you don't discover that person, does that trigger a loss state for the game?
It doesn't trigger a loss state, no.
Okay.
But it won't trigger the true win state. So
okay. All right. I didn't want to get too much into spoilers there.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so again, so for those of you watching, to lose at the Shrouded Isle, you either need one of the 5 core traits to fall below the acceptable threshold, or you need a house to enter a rebellious state. And either one of those 2 conditions, if they persist throughout the end of the season, as in you can't correct it, the game fails. And I have a few questions for you about that, but before we get to them, I guess, how did losing or winning at a game like this come about during the design?
Right. So initially, the game jam version was just like a survival, right? A survival-oriented, last as long as you can kind of thing. And if any of the bars drop too low, then it's game over. But what I discovered during playtesting was that at some level, like at the start of the playthrough, it felt very random, or rather like I wanted the game to feel difficult, or at least like I wanted to convey a sense of desperation, and so the stats were swingier, I guess. Like each interaction had a bigger impact, but that resulted in like a sudden death very quickly, and so that's where the the 1 turn warning comes in. So like right now in the game, as you mentioned earlier, Josh, that any critical stat can be corrected within a turn, then you can keep going. And I think the ideal experience for the game would be that each season, something as a result of your actions from your previous season is like a one of the either the family opinions as a family approvals, or the 5 values of Chernobog is down to critical. and it is a major consideration for you in moving forward. Like you need to address this in some way, and the next season, because of what you were trying to do to fix that problem, you forgot about something. You forgot to appease the Yosefka family, or you focused on fervor so much, but your fervor advisor was someone who lacks obedience, and therefore now obedience is down, and so forth. And that this is like a careful balancing act, this a constant tightrope walking, was something that I wanted to accomplish with the defeat condition.
Yeah. And Gamepad that we talked about a few minutes ago regarding the randomness, or making sure that the player isn't always in complete control. This is, of course, one of the more polarizing aspects, not just of the Shrouded Isle, but any games that throw in the sense of probability, or again, that uncertainty through play. Because we've seen this in games where I guess it goes back to either having a very strong or very negative feedback loop. As in, if you start winning well, it will be very easy to keep winning. But if you start losing, it becomes a lot harder to steer that ship, in a manner of speaking, or realign.
Right, I mean, it becomes a death spiral.
Yeah. And I guess before I ask this question of you, Jongwoo, did you happen to play the game Tharsis that was released? I think it was either 2016 or 2015.
That's the dice roll-based space survival. Yeah, I didn't play it myself, but I thought the concept was fascinating.
Yeah, because that I felt had a very similar reaction I had with the Shrouded Isle, in the sense that if you get unlucky, like let's say the very first season of the game, you don't find anyone with a major vice. And you start that spiral down of, I'm picking people with minors, so everyone's getting more angry at me. It becomes a lot harder than correct it, as opposed to saying, the very first season, we find a major vice, everyone's generally accepting my traits are at pretty reasonable levels. And I guess my question for you is, in terms of, again, that either downward spiral or positive or just keep on winning, how did you approach, I guess, fine-tuning that with the Shrouded Isle?
You're asking about the approach specifically, or?
Yeah, or like trying to like balance between, complete victory versus just that downward spiral, I can't do anything, I'm just going to lose kind of feel.
Right. Getting it even to the way it works in the game, like in the current release, was like a long process. I mean, there wasn't anything like a fancy per se. As I mentioned earlier, once I realized that small incremental changes over time in a closed ecosystem adds up very quickly. It made me much more careful about the values that I put in. So like focusing on like a single advisor, for instance, right? No matter how bad your approval rating is with a given family, if you focus on that advisor, like you're able to get it out of a critical state. Of course, the challenge is that maybe you have other considerations. Maybe you don't want to pick that advisor for whatever reason. But I made sure that there is an out that'll at least get you to the next season, assuming that the advisors that you've even selected are ones that would be useful to you. And of course, if there's multiple critical factors that are active at the same time, then it's then the game is over.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I mean, I'm not sure that the Shrouded Isle as is like actually accomplish the balance that I would love to have in the game. At some level, I actually find a degree of like unfairness, so to speak, interesting, because it forces players to adapt, right? And I'd say like the most unfair thing, if you will, about the game is the lack of information at the start of the game. And yet, at the same time, I feel that over the course of multiple seasons, like, a rational player will mostly be able to adapt, no matter what the initial generation is. and in some ways that actually makes the game easier than necessary. But at another level, I guess like I didn't feel like dice rolls really screwed the player in the Shrouded Isle as it's right now. But maybe you disagree, given your personal experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you had a really good point there, Jongwoo, regarding being unfair to the player. Because this is one of those elements that you really have to handle with a deft touch when it comes to game design. Like when we look at game design from a high level point of view, most people agree that you always want to put the player's interests first. So you always want to give the player everything they need to succeed. But when you have a game like the Shrouded Isle, or even something like XCOM, Darkest Dungeon, or Tharsis, there is that sense of, as you said, unfairness. There has to be. Because if the player, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier regarding information, excuse me, if the player is given all the information they need, like if this was like any other game or a game that wasn't designed around this, it would essentially break the game. As in, if I knew exactly, okay, this guy will always do this, or if I do this, I know exactly what my actions are going to do, the game becomes very repetitive, it becomes very easy to break. But, as we've seen, whenever we have these elements, it becomes very polarizing among communities, especially, as to just how unfair do you want to make this game. Because, as we've seen, people can view this as either one of two ways. They either say, okay, the game is challenging me, I need to step up, or this game is cheating, the every popular, 95% chance I miss, the game is broken, the developers suck. Like, we've seen that discussion in just about every game with probability.
Right. I mean, so, XCOM and, you mentioned Darkest Dungeon as well. I mean, they're interesting in that, there's always, you could always retreat, right? I mean, it's not like at a macro level, it's not gaining you much, but at least you're not losing anything. And I guess I feel that even if the immediate situation is stacked against the player, as long as you provide the player a means of continuing somehow, like a Pyrrhic victory, as it were, I mean, is that so bad? I mean, it is a certain a mindset, right?
Yes.
And so, I'm a huge fan of Dark Souls and, various, roguelike inspired designs as of late. And so maybe my personal taste skewed towards, low probability, or sorry, not low probability, but high stakes, I guess, situations. But I guess for the Shrouded Isle specifically, the hidden information actually has, I guess, kind of a secondary purpose, if you will, and it's that in a lot of management games or builders, you're expanding spatially, right? But the Shrouded Isle does not does not do that, right? You don't construct things. You're not gonna build another estate. You're not gonna be able to gain resources over that. You can't spiral that way. And so it's for progression, it was important to have something to take that place. And discovering traits of the townspeople, I feel, accomplishes that. You feel like your understanding of the town changes over time because you literally know more about the people and how to react to the various individuals. Or if we tie it to the way the dreams work in the game, you have a better sense of, okay, so I am looking for the pervert, and I know that the pervert is someone who lacks discipline, and I know because of the for those of you who haven't played it yet, there's multiple stages of revealing a trait in the game. So initially you might know nothing about someone's vice, but over time you might know just a rumor about that person's vice, and eventually reveal the full state of that person's vice. And so you'd be able to track that. Okay, so these people are either have unknown vices or have they lack discipline, and so I'm gonna guess it's the guy from the Kechny family because for whatever reason. and like that mind game, or rather, it's not quite mind game, but rather like the mental model that the player has when they're in that situation. I think that's what's interesting about the hidden information for me.
Yeah.
Like the fact that you're asked to make a guess, you're asked to take a risk, or maybe some players won't engage with it that way, but that's okay. But personally, when I'm gonna reveal something. I mean, I'm sure Josh, you've discovered it yourself, but like the sacrifice animations in the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you kill a major sinner, like way more blood spurts out.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the feeling when you haven't quite revealed the traits of somebody, and you guess that okay, so it's most likely this person, and you're right. Like at the successful deduction that happens. I think it's something that's not usually represented in games very well, and it's something that I feel is very special about the Shrouded Isle, especially in the management genre, which is often like very, very transparent about what goes on.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing, like regarding again, like that psychological aspect of choosing, and again, I guess bringing the personalities of these characters to light. One thing that I didn't touch on that I wanted to bring up here regarding choosing your 5 advisors that I thought was very interesting. As you said, you can choose advisors that you either know about or advisors that you're just trying to figure out, what's their major, what are their vice and virtues.
Yeah.
And one aspect that I thought was very interesting is that you can choose someone that you know is a major vice. You basically just choose like your scapegoat before you even start the season. Like the old adage, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Absolutely.
I just thought that was like a very interesting touch of, this whole kind of like personalities of these characters.
Yeah, I really love that duality of the game. It's as I mentioned earlier about like how similar to the way like attributes work in the Hunger Games and such. It's like there's the ostensible purpose of the advisors and why you should be selecting them. But like players usually grok that, okay, wait a minute, like I have to kill somebody. So like by season 2, the second season of the first year, most players will think, okay, so I'm going to pick a scapegoat. Like I'm going to pick my whipping boy just in case I don't discover anyone else that's worth killing this season.
All right, so I think with that, I know we are approaching a little bit over an hour into this cast, so I know we could probably sit here and chat all night long. I guess, what's the time where you are at, Jongwoo?
It's 7:20.
Oh, I think we're on the same time zone. It's always, I'm so used to talking to people in completely different time zones doing these casts. I was like, what time is it where you are? Oh, it's like 9 o'clock at night. What about you? It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon here. But I do have, I guess, a few final questions for you, and then we will wrap things up. Sure. I guess didn't see too many people in the podcast, so hopefully we'll get some comments when this gets archived up on YouTube. But we've talked, talked bits and pieces about what you would like to see expanded on in the Shrouded Isle, given the chance to work on it. So, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this because it's a very interesting aspect. Now, when it comes to post-release support, adding more content, it's very much based, or it's really dependent on the genre or design of the game. Like as we've talked about before on these conversations, the simplest way of adding more content is simply just expanding the amount of time. If my game has 10 levels, I can add, a 3-level expansion. Right. What we see in games like The Darkest Dungeon or XCOM, they went with more of a supplemental idea, as in we're going to keep the game length the same, but we're going to add in systems and encounters to mix things up. Right. So with the Shrouded Isle, I guess with if you're given the chance to expand it, what are some aspects that you feel you would like to improve or extend with future support?
So 2 big things for me are making adding interactions to the work phase, as I mentioned earlier. No matter what happens during the phase, whether the advisor is successful or whether you discover their vice, what have you, have some sort of a player response to that would be interesting. I'm not sure what form that should take yet, but it's something that I'd like to expand. The other part is the way the inquiries work right now. I feel like inquisitions should be more directed. So there's a lot of feedback about, so like we were just talking the randomness and unfairness and such. And one complaint is that, hey, I can't control whether this inquiry reveals more about someone's virtue or someone's bias. And of course, if the player could control it in the current scheme, everyone would want to reveal vice because it's like it is more impactful. I guess so the aspect that I mentioned earlier about the engaging with the townspeople, actually talking to those people, I'd like to bring some of that back and into the existing inquiries and trait revealing system. Beyond those two, so those would be more systemic changes that I would like to do, right? I think we'd like to look at just the certain physicality of the island. It is an island, right? So we haven't really looked at what's going on in the water, like how the townspeople's relationship to the ocean as much as we'd like to. And so that's another angle that further content, whether that's a story, events, or even some new aspect of the game that we haven't designed yet. If we were to expand the project, those are the vectors that we'd be looking at.
Yeah, one thing that I found, just from my experience playing the game, I know that at the start of each season, there's a chance of you getting an event. You get that letter, and you have to make a choice. Yeah. And one thing that I thought would be interesting, I'm not sure if it's actually in the game yet, but having those events kind of, your decisions kind of coming back and impacting things going forward. One instance would be a stranger washes up on shore, and you have to decide whether to kill him or let him go.
Right.
And then having that choice maybe come back in a future season, or having more, again, as we've talked about, that intersection between narrative and design, and having more of these story elements impact the game along that front.
Absolutely. And so for clarity, there are events that have future follow-ups or consequences. But you're right, there could easily be more of that in the game. And I guess the letters, the events that you're mentioning, they are very sectioned off. You go to the cathedral to read them right now. Whereas I guess I'd want them to feel more integrated, or maybe there should be different types of events that could trigger. I don't know, but you're right. Intersecting the narrative with the core systems should be a priority as well.
Now, I guess another question for you, Jongwoo, regarding expanding the game.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself adding in, if given the chance, adding in more systems in terms of, as we said, right now the core of the game is interacting with the houses, choosing the advisors, running the seasons, and then, of course, the sacrifice and the fall from that.
Right.
Do you see yourself, or do you see the possibility of adding in another layer, or do you think, at this point, the Shrouded Isle, in terms of, the systems being as they are now, that it's pretty much, closed in, or it's pretty much set in that terms of a design?
So, the two improvements that I mentioned earlier would be systemic changes to different degrees, but they're very, micro scale, right? It's adding more interactions to something that's already working.
Yes.
I think probably the bigger systemic change that needs to be added to the Shrouded Isle is making the campaigns feel more different each time, right? And I think. So one thing that we discussed during development was, shouldn't there be different, let's say on the final year, based on your alignment with a given family, shouldn't there be different outcomes or like paths towards different endings? And while there are triggers for different endings right now, they're relatively simplistic, and um, like just you don't feel like you're engaging with the powers within the town as much as we intended to. And so, like, I guess like I would want a late game dynamics change of like something. I'm not sure what form that should take, but it's something something that I would like to work on.
Yeah. And again, it's very interesting when we're talking about games like the Shrouded Isle that are built around these closed systems in the sense that it's not as simple as saying I'm going to add a new level or I'm going to add a 6 resource for you to manage. It has to be, at one point, it has to be kept within the confines of your game systems, but it's always a challenge of, could I add something else? Could I add another plate for the player to juggle, in a manner of speaking?
Right. And sorry, just to add to what you were saying there, a big concern would be that whatever that gets added, in order to make that interesting, it inevitably tips the scales, and it'll change like the balance as it is right now. In some ways, so like, there's a for hardcore management players that they want more stuff, like they want more progression. And it was never my intent with the project to have a significant 20, 30 hour like a playtime for a given session.
Yeah.
At the same time though, I would like to see different, at least like aesthetically different outcomes happen. And like maybe that means that we should be investing more into more like a particular story events that trigger based on like a more complex set of triggers from like what you did in like the first and second year.
I know there's been a few games that have done that in terms of like having like a macro event that can happen, like some kind of end game trigger that kind of shifts the game into a different direction. Like I know Sid Meier's Colonization, I think, had like when the British invade, like, and then that changed things over. Battle Brawlers, if I remember right, has like 2 or 3, like only one of these major events can happen, but then that's kind of like that transition point from mid game to end game. That then now that of course is predestined. Like nothing I do is going to determine that, but it's still something that impacts things. And what you just said a few minutes ago, Jongwoo, I thought was another very interesting point, again, is the length of these games. Yeah. Whenever we have games built around, especially these polarizing win or loss states, it's very tricky knowing just how long these games can be. Because, like, as going back to what we said with the Darkest Dungeon, there are high stakes to each dungeon, but the actual dungeon may be like 20 minutes to an hour. Maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depending upon the length.
Right.
But, like, imagine if we're playing, like, a 30, 40-hour game, and there's always that possibility that you can lose completely and go back to start. People are a lot more agitated, a lot more divisive about that. Like, I'll give you an example for myself. Like, I play Diablo 3 on Iron Man settings, and of course, if you don't know what that means, for those of you watching, it means if I die, my character's wiped. There's no second chance or third chance. So if that character dies 5 minutes in or 50 hours in, the game doesn't care. And it's very tricky to design games around that. Now, with something like Diablo 3, it's a choice. You can choose to play the game softcore or hardcore. But like as we said, with games like Dark Souls, Darkest Dungeon, a lot of games with Dark in the title or FTL, the more that there is to do, or the more weight, it becomes a lot more heated when that player loses.
Right.
Looks like Oscar in chat was offering suggestions regarding like having like climate events, like rains or fogs or something that could affect different events. Could be a possibility as well.
It would be interesting for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like it's always tricky because as we've seen, as you're no doubt aware with designing the game, little things can come back to impact things in a very big way. Like, I was just about to think, like, in small numbers do really matter in games like this. The difference between a +1 and a +3 can mean the difference between whether or not someone's happy with you, or they're in the rebellious state, and now you have a new fire to put out for the next season.
Right.
Now, I think with that, I know, Oscar, you are coming in late, but we are going to be wrapping things up probably in the next 5-10 minutes at the most. So this is going to be the final call for questions from the chat for anyone watching. So I guess to begin to wrap things up on your end, Jongwoo, I guess for people watching, do you have any current plans, or like, is there anything coming down the pipeline for the Shrouded Isle?
So I don't want to promise anything right now. We were talking internally about what we could do. What is a viable thing? So the tricky thing with the Shrouded Isle is that, as I mentioned at the earlier on in the cast, it was a part-time project for the company, and it involves people that are not directly affiliated with the company as well. So scheduling becomes difficult. As far as whether we want to, I think generally we would love to be able to add more systems, more content to the game. There's more patches coming, and the small content pack, so to speak, that will be coming. I can't say when yet, but we'll be doing post-launch support for sure.
Okay. Oscar was asking, do you see a mobile version for the Shrouded Isle?
I can't promise anything, but it seems quite likely that we'll be looking at that option.
Okay. And I guess for fans of Kitfox watching this, either live or recorded, can you tease anything about the next project coming from Kitfox at the moment?
I really can't.
I know.
But I mean, so the kinds of things that we like to make. So what can I say? There's certain similarities to both Moonhunters and Shattered Planet that we're looking at for the next project.
Cool.
So if you've been fans of either, then you'll have a good time.
Yep, and again, this is a very interesting game to talk about. I know, it's one of those weird cases where normally when we talk about a game, we can talk about in terms of the macro sense of it. But as we've seen, or as we've discussed over the last hour and a half, that each system in of itself has its own unique quirks and intricacies to discuss. So it has been a fascinating cast with you, Jongwoo, and again, thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure to be here.
All right. I think I am just about out of questions. I know we've gone over our initial runtime. So I guess for you, regarding the Shrouded Isle in terms of design or discussions or anything like that, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would like to bring up before we say goodnight? I know, I always ask these questions, and everyone's like, we've talked about so much, I can't think of anything else.
I feel like probably the one thing we didn't really directly talk about is the way the dreams feature into the structure of the game. But, I mean, it's part of, the macro level changes that we talked about earlier. It was intended as an attempt to guide the player as well as give changing circumstances. But yeah, I mean, other than that, I think we've covered pretty much every aspect of the game.
Cool. And just to expand on that for those of you watching this, what we're referring to is at the start of each new season, or is it each new season or each new year?
The trigger is different than that.
Okay.
But every so often.
Yeah. You get a dream that will tell you to focus on a different trait. What happens is the threshold for success or failure for that specific trait becomes bigger, as in the game will want a higher rating for that specific trait. And then you're given the update about find, the specific major vice. And as you said, Jongwoo, it becomes like a guiding point for the player, but it also becomes another way that the game kind of throws a curveball at you. As in, let's say it's ignorance that it wants to do, but let's say you were ignoring that for the last 3 seasons, like that, and that's what happened to me in my game. It was like, oh, I'm just at the threshold, we're fine, we don't need to do any more of that. And then I get a dream saying, you must focus on ignorance, and now the bar is pushed all the way to the other. I'm like, nuts.
Yeah, for sure. So.
All right. But I think we can say good night for now. So, again, thank you so much for coming on, and best of luck for yourself and the rest of Kitfox Games. I'm definitely interested to see what comes next with the Shrouded Isle, and whatever is your next project.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me to the podcast.
No problem. If you or anyone else from Kickbox would like to come back on, either for another live chat or for one of our recorded ones, definitely feel free to get in touch with me. It's an open invite.
Awesome. We'll definitely consider it. Thank you.
Awesome. So with that said, we are going to end things here. Thank you so much for watching this, whether you're enjoying this live or the recorded version up on YouTube. Again, the Shrouded Isle is currently available on Steam. It's available on GOG. Is it on Humble Bundle as well at the moment?
So it's on Steam, it's on Humble Bundle, and it's also on itch right now.
All right. So be sure to check it out. If you want to watch my Let's Play of it, I'll include a link to that in the notes below, as well as to my review over on GameWisdom.com. So again, Jongwoo, thank you so much for coming on. If you wouldn't mind hanging on Skype for like a minute or two afterwards, I just have a few post-cast questions for you.
No problem.
All right, so with that said, it is time to say goodnight. Again, we could probably sit here and chat more about the Shrouded Isle for who knows how long, probably until we actually have to do a sacrifice, but we will end things here. For those of you watching this live right now, I probably will have one more live chat later on this evening. I'll have to see how my voice is doing, because we've been doing a lot of talking this week. But again, if you're watching this recorded, be sure to like and subscribe, and check back for daily discussions on game design here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. I guess just to throw it back to you, Jongwoo, to end things on, do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say to the fans to wrap up our little chat?
To the fans, well, I guess thank you so much for giving this weird little macabre game a chance.
All right. So, with that said, thanks again for tuning in. And I will now go probably drink 5 bottles of water and see if my voice can recover for our later chat. Again, thank you for coming on, and hopefully we can do this again real soon.
Sure, yeah.
Alright, folks, so with that said, thanks for tuning in to this Perceptive Podcast. Be sure to check back again for future discussions, and we'll chat again next time. Until then, take care.